Alright, this section will cover Chapter 21, Section 1, Part A, page 496 to 498. As I mentioned previously, we looked at the immigration, the millions of people coming into the United States, and in this section we'll look at what daily life was like for them, and as I said, it is not a pleasant way to have to live. This shows you the change in U.S. population as far as rural, meaning out in the country, the farmers, the ranchers, as opposed to people living in the urban areas, which are the big cities. And as you can see, there was a huge change in where people were settling, and that was primarily because of the millions of immigrants that were coming to the United States. By the time this new wave was coming after the 1890s, there wasn't any more land available. And plus, they didn't have the money to buy it, even if there was land available. So they ended up living in the cities, and again, mostly in those ethnic neighborhoods that we looked at previously. But you can see a huge difference in basically where people are now living in the early 1900s. They're living in the cities, the urban population. With all these millions of people moving into the cities, it's obviously going to create a lot of problems in the urban areas, primarily with crime, with violence, with disease, just pollution of all different kinds. And again, as we saw previously, the nativists are still working hard, blaming the immigrants for all the problems in life. Most of these immigrants ended up living in tenements, and in a tenement was a cheaply built apartment buildings, often overcrowded. There was no electricity, no running water. They're dark and dirty. Multiple families living in small, tiny rooms. Disease can spread like wildfire through these. Children especially were affected by disease, and many of them killed. We would call these slums probably in today's language. Just where people are living in very terrible conditions. Jacob Riis at the time was a journalist, and he went around these tenement areas in the big cities taking pictures, and then he wrote books, and his most famous book was called How the Other Half Lives. The other half meaning the poor living in the tenements, and kind of showed what life was like for them, and it really brought it to the attention of a lot of people. Had no idea how terrible the conditions were that a lot of these people were having to live in. Child labor was also a big problem. Most of these immigrants, as we saw before, are working in the factories because they're uneducated. And factory jobs, you didn't need any education. It was pulling a lever, putting a top on a jar, that kind of thing. But children were also put to work because a lot of these machinery, you needed kind of smaller hands to move in between the moving parts. Terrible working conditions. These factories were called sweatshops basically, and it's mostly where the poor work. They work long hours, 12 to 15 hours a day, very little time for breaks, very little pay, working a 15-hour day for maybe 80-90 cents a day, which obviously in today's market isn't much, but even back then that wasn't a whole lot of money. But children got paid even less than that. They worked the same long hours as the adults, but they got paid even less than the adults were paid. So again, just a very miserable way of life. Children aren't going to school, they're going to work in the factories because families needed money in order to survive. With these factory conditions, the factories, as I said, very dirty, again, very little lighting, very little in the way of like fresh air going through, just dangerous working conditions. And the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory kind of brought all this to a head. What happened was in 1911, a fire broke out in the building. You can see a picture there of the building up in the top floors. And this was primarily women, some children, but mostly young women who were working in this particular factory. They were working on sewing machines and making clothes. And the fire broke out, but they were locked in to their rooms, and they weren't able to get out. The fire escapes were broken as well. As I said, the working conditions were terrible, and 146 women were killed. About half that number jumped out of the window rather than burned to death. And the one picture, unfortunately, shows you some of the bodies of the women who chose to jump out of the window to their death rather than be asphyxiated or burned alive. So just a terrible, terrible situation. Thousands of people down on the streets watching, unable to do anything, but kind of hear the screams and, watch the terrible scene kind of play out before them. You did, however, at this time have some people who tried to help. And one of these reformers was a woman named Jane Addams, and she built a settlement house. And a settlement house became like a community center. And there's a picture there. She created what was called Hull House in Chicago. It was the first of these well-known settlement houses. And they were basically kind of a community center where poor people in the neighborhood could come. They could get medical checks. There were libraries. There were classes so they could learn to speak English. There were nurseries there. So for women who had to work, somewhere they could leave their babies. You could get a hot meal. Kindergartens were started. Eventually, it was just kind of like a saving place for all these poor people living in the tenements and living and working in these terrible conditions. There was a place of kind of refuge for them. They could come together, they could get a break, and get some help that they very seriously needed. So again, Jane Addams, she was built the first of these settlement houses. She was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize because of her actions. In other cities across the United States, settlement houses were built as well, but she's the one that kind of started this whole reform movement, basically, of helping the people who are desperately in need of help.